Today we're going to talk about Stefan Klasen's paper, Does Gender Inequality Reduce Growth and Development? Evidence from Cross-Country Regressions. And I'm going to have the paper here by me and to go through it, and I expect that you would also have a copy of the paper or have it online so that you can have access to it while you're watching the video. This paper has been a very well cited, important paper in establishing that link between gender inequality and growth and development that we've been talking about, and that is in some sense the point of this course. Klasen starts out in the introduction with a general overview of why we might think gender equality is important for two reasons. One reason, of course, is that inequality in the sense of much lower standards of well-being and opportunities for women is a problem in its own right for 50% of a country's population or of the world's population. And then a second reason why it may be of concern is that gender inequality might be Pareto inefficient. That is, it might be worse for everyone. More gender equality might enable economies to grow more rapidly, per capita incomes to grow more rapidly, and so men and women benefit from that extra economic growth. Klasen's key finding is here on page 2 at the top. The paper shows that gender bias in education and employment appears to have significant negative impact on economic growth. It also leads to higher fertility and child mortality. So that's a very strong statement about the link between gender equality and economic growth. Klasen then moves on in the next section to a review of gender and economic growth, the literature. It starts off with a discussion of the classic economics approaches to explaining why some countries grow more rapidly than others. And there we have the neoclassical growth theory, or the standard growth theory, that says that countries that grow faster because they invest more. They save more, they invest more, their populations grow faster, so there's certainly a demographic effect to economic growth. If a country is having very rapid population growth, so that there's a lot of children, a lot of dependents, adults who are working aren't able to invest and have to instead spend on consumption for their children. So down the line, then those 10 years where investments didn't happen as that boomlet of children were catered to, in some sense the children who are in the investment, that delays economic growth. Then when those children become adults, if they in turn aren't having as many children, so if a country goes through a demographic transition, what Klasen here and others call the demographic gift, so that you have a large proportion of the population that's working age and a small proportion of the population that is dependent on them, not so many old people, not so many young people, then you get very rapid economic growth. So certainly the classical theory says the more capital you invest, the more factories you build, the more roads that are paved, the more rapid growth will be after that. The other kind of growth theory is associated with the Romer, and is often called endogenous growth theory, and that sort of suggests that when countries grow rapidly, they learn things about how to produce things more efficiently. So this endogenous growth theory says it's possible for countries that don't have a lot of capital to stay stuck in a low-level growth path, because even though if they don't have a lot of capital, they have a high return to capital. If there's not very much capital, the return to capital may not be as high as it is in a developed economy, where you have already a lot of capital and where your investment takes advantage of all the investments that others have made. So there's an externality from growth. Investments that people make in turn benefit and encourage other people to make investments, and they become more profitable. In the poorer country case, you make an investment because nobody else has made investments. The return on your investment is lower than it would have been in a rich country. So that's the difference between the solo classical growth models and the endogenous growth models. The endogenous growth model suggests that the world might experience divergence, that the rich countries keep growing more rapidly than poorer countries. The classical theory says that there should be convergence, that rich countries, they have a lot of capital, they have a lot of human capital, so the returns to further investments in that should be lower. That's the classical theory. So those are some of the debates in growth theory. Klasen's not addressing those debates, but rather is focusing on the gender dimension. And there raised the possibility of a kind of poverty trap equilibrium of low growth for an economy that has high gender inequality, that is very low levels of opportunities and education for females may have low growth rates, and those and high fertility, so women with low education levels may see their best outcome as having a lot of children. The lot of children in turn causes there to be low investment, and then there's fewer opportunities for education for women, and women stay uneducated. Klasen then goes on to have on page 3 a discussion of how to estimate cross-country growth regressions. And it's a little technical discussion in terms of what variables to include, how they should be included. And the bottom line is down on page 3, where the solo model, the classical growth model, suggests that the variables for inclusion would be the investment rate, the population growth rate, and the level of initial income at the start of the period for which we're trying to explain variation in growth. So Klasen's going to take that as being the minimal data required to estimate cross-country growth regressions, and is going to add to those investment rate, population growth rate, and initial income the gender balances, measures of gender inequality. The discussion on page 4 is interesting for our purposes because we talked about multicollinearity before. So Klasen notes at the bottom the odd finding that 2 earlier researchers, Barrow and Lee, had found when they included measures of women's education and men's education, years of schooling. They found that women's years of schooling had a negative impact on growth. So this would seem to be very bizarre, very, very strange. So it's pretty clear that men's schooling and women's schooling are very closely correlated, and so if you include both of them in the regression, there's multicollinearity. That is, the regression's unable to allocate how changes in growth due to increases in education levels for women and increases in educational levels for men, how to allocate them across those 2 increases because the increases are so closely correlated. So it's a good example of why you try not to include 2 measuring the same thing. So both of them are measuring the overall level of education in society. So if you want to run the regression, as Klasen suggests, one possible way to do it is to have a measure of schooling, education attainment, and then a measure of the gender ratio or the gender disparity in that schooling, and that can solve the multicollinearity problem. Countries that have high levels of education might have low gender ratios. Countries that have low overall levels of of education might have very even gender ratios. The discussion on page 5 is on another very influential study, cross-country study, the influence of gender on economic outcomes, the study by Dollar and Gaddy. And the key point there, for our purposes, is that Dollar and Gaddy suggests that it's the interaction term of gender equality, measures of gender equality in educational attainment, and income. So those 2 interacted, you multiply gender equality by the level of income in the country, that's going to be the main determinant of how gender equality affects economic growth. So high gender equality at low levels of income, it turns out, really poor countries, it doesn't matter if they're real unequal gender-wise. It doesn't have any effect on growth. But as income levels rise, then gender equality does seem to matter for outcomes for economic growth. So that interaction term that Dollar and Gaddy focus on is something that we've been seeing occasionally, usually in the context of dummy variables, where the interaction term can be very important. Klasen then follows with some discussion of theory, and I think it's worth going through and thinking about each one of the 6 arguments that he has for why gender inequality affects economic growth outcomes. The first is very simple. If there's high inequality in education, so that 75% of all the kids in the class are boys and only 25% are girls, then that means that the bottom of that 75% of boys are probably not very good students, whereas you have fewer girls in school, so that means a bunch of girls, the 75% of girls who aren't in school, probably a lot of them would have been really good students. So you're distorting the mix of talent of kids who should be in school towards selecting the kids who aren't really that good in school and having them be in school and keeping out kids, girls who would be good in school. So there's an immediate effect there from distorting the talent basis for schooling that will then generate economic growth later on. That's compounded if we think that girls' schooling female schooling has externality effects in terms of how children in the next generation are being raised. So if we think, and so many studies show this, that males' impacts on their families are smaller in terms of investments in children and well-being of children than females, then we have this externality effect that suggests all the more reason why a society would want to have gender-neutral education. A third factor that they talk about are these demographic factors, this demographic gift that I talked about earlier, that female education reduces fertility. By reducing fertility, you increase the ability of the current generation to make investments. They don't have to spend as much of their income on consumption for their children. So you get this boom in economic growth. And if you think the endogenous economic growth theories are the right ones, then the initial boom in economic growth becomes self-reinforcing. Higher economic activity makes more investments more productive. So that's a third reason why gender inequality growth. Klasen then talks about some of the inequalities in employment. Same thing again as innovation. If you're restricting your pool of talent, your labor market, to only the best women and a lot of mediocre men, then you're going to have less growth than